I closed the first half of this church architecture review with the bronze doors of St. Michael's of Hildesheim and a word about dramatic entrances. Romanesque churches carry doors to a whole new level. These churches were built to house relics and to attract pilgrims to see these relics. And the master builders were all about wowing and terrifying the pilgrims who crossed their threshold. Now, this is not one of your required images, but I included this church portal because it demonstrates something you will need to remember for the test, which is that the Romanesque era saw the revival of monumental stone sculpture. This portal from a Romanesque pilgrimage church in France has an especially impressive trumeau. Remember, that's the pillar in the middle of the door. The church entrance on the upper left is one of your required images and will show up on the test. So will the photo of the church. So what scene does the work on the upper left portray? What is that half circle over the door called? There is one rather tough question about the sculpture above the door, so I'm going to use the process of elimination to help you. The theme was common in Romanesque sculpture, right? The spatial setting is symbolic rather than realistic, right? The work really doesn't present a continuous narrative, but instead a set-piece moment. But the sculpture is all about, well, it's the remaining answer, which you would probably know anyway. Hint, consider what Christ is doing with his hands. Note that the saved and the damned are separated, with the saved on the left and the damned on the right as we look at the door. This spatial segregation reinforced the point that pilgrims entered the church as sinners, but the pilgrimage helped ensure that they would leave numbered among the saved. So movement through the church was in a way echoed in the geometry of the frieze. There are some more question hints. Where was the church built? And along what kind of route and headed toward what specific destination? What earlier sacred spaces that we studied had a quite similar religious function? Think about reliquaries, and for that matter, know what a reliquary is. This map should help with one of those questions. So what does it portray? I've circled Conques, the site of our required Romanesque church. And here's a labeled floor plan and photo of the nave from that church, the Pilgrimage Monastery Church, and you again need to know the name. Note that the church design evolved to address the needs of pilgrimage. So, for example, the radiating chapels were built to hold relics, and the ambulatory, that's in blue, made it easier for pilgrims to get to the relics without disturbing the monks during their many religious services. The transept was now quite wide to accommodate the crowds, and note that the church's master builder added a transept exit, basically, presumably, to help with crowd control. The interior photo on the right reveals a nave with only 2 levels, and that nave is covered with a rounded arched barrel vault defined by a series of transverse arches, the most characteristic features of Romanesque churches. The bottom level with those arched openings is the arcade, and the upper level where people could walk around is a gallery, sometimes also called a tribune. In late Romanesque and Gothic churches like Chartres, this will flatten out and become basically a decorative triforium rather than a space that holds additional worshipers. Note that in this church, only the apse has a layer of clerestory windows. The nave does not. The barrel vaults enable the ceiling to soar, but not to the heights we will see in Gothic churches, or for that matter, that we saw in the Byzantine dome church Hagia Sophia. Stone barrel vaults are less likely to catch fire than timber roofs, but they are heavy. So, what kind of adjectives would you apply to Romanesque architecture? Massive, heavy, impressive, symmetrical, any of those would work. So one of the ways that Romanesque church architects supported the heavy barrel vault stone ceilings was by using buttresses. In Romanesque churches, these buttresses were engaged stone columns. That is, they were columns attached to the church wall, and I've circled one in red. The photo on the right isn't one of your required images, but it gives you a clearer view of the semicircular apse and of the radiating chapels. To hold up those heavy stone vaulted ceilings, Romanesque master builders also used heavy piers. And here's still another view of the church's nave and a diagram that offers more detail about a compound pier and how it's constructed. I don't think you need to know all these terms, but you do need to know compound pier. And here's an interior view from a different Romanesque church that should help you answer the question posed on the slide. Think about those radiating chapels and the passageways that pilgrims would use to get to them. This photo should give you a clue. So here's a final Romanesque church review. I'm highlighting some more questions that will appear on the test. What is the mathematical unit at the center of a Romanesque church plan where the transept and the nave intersect? I've outlined it in green to help you out, and it's on your matching quiz. The nave of the church is organized in three-dimensional modules based on the unit I've outlined in yellow, and I'll tell you that one's called a bay. So what architectural features articulate, that is, define these three-dimensional bays? You can see them pretty clearly in the photo. What kind of pillars do you see? I'll remind you again that the round arches that span the nave are known as transverse arches, and yes, you do need to know that term. So what kind of vault, again, covers the nave of the church? Characteristic of the period? I just used the term in an earlier slide. So the photo of the interior, again, shows a two-story elevation similar to what we saw in an earlier slide. The bottom level, the one defined by the piers and the arches, is the nave arcade. What's the level above it called? I just told you a few slides ago. And again, in some churches, it's where the women sit. Another hint, people could walk around the nave at this level. The smaller piers aren't merely decorative, so it's not a triforium. Check out the answer on your matching quizzes. And now we move on to Gothic art. So why were Abbot Suger and his church at Saint-Denis so important to art history? The photo and the floor plan should give you a big hint. The radiating chapels you should see have opened up to create a huge clerestory of stained glass, bringing into the church what Abbot Suger called lux nova, new light. The spiritual force of light, he believed, led worshippers' thoughts toward the divine. This was a major element in Gothic Christian thought, and in part it reflected ideas that arose from a renewed study of classical writers, especially Aristotle and Plato. Remember that this was the age when universities were being established in cities and Christian humanism was on the rise. Romanesque churches were mostly part of monasteries, often monasteries in relatively rural areas on the road to a pilgrimage site such as Santiago de Compostela. Gothic churches were built as urban churches, reflecting the rise of major cities such as Paris. Gothic churches were also often associated with royal power. Certainly this is true both of Saint-Denis and our required church, Chartres. But cities also competed to build the highest and most elaborate cathedrals, and some of them went higher than mathematics and good sense allowed, and they collapsed on their parishioners, sometimes killing thousands of people at a time. If you watch our extra credit movie on Gothic cathedrals, you'll learn more about that. The Nova video does this better, but let me give you a quick review of the architectural innovations that made it possible for Gothic churches to soar so high and to break up their walls with huge expanses of stained glass. Pointed arches were used to direct weight onto load-bearing columns at a sharp angle, which allowed for taller vaulted ceilings. Unlike early Romanesque-style churches, Gothic churches emphasized height and verticality, although many Romanesque churches would actually go quite tall. So where did Gothic architects get this idea for pointed arches? Well, remember that a whole lot of Christians had just been off in the Holy Land on crusades, where they'd had a chance to look at some of the marvels of Islamic architecture. And of course, the Arabs took the idea from pre-Islamic Sassanid Persians. Art history is all about creative borrowing. A second innovation that allowed Gothic churches to soar higher and include huge stained glass windows was the flying buttress. Gothic architects did away with the tribune galleries, exposed the buttresses, and pared them down to slender skeletal supports. They also carved them and topped them with little spires, making the buttress essentially part of the decorative element of the facade. So this slide helpfully relates the flying buttresses of Chartres Cathedral to the floor plan. Rib vaults were a third innovation that permitted Gothic cathedrals to expand vertically and to accommodate walls of glass. By the way, this image on the right, which was taken further down the nave of Chartres Cathedral, should help you answer another question. Where was the worshipper's attention drawn upon entering the cathedral? Well, it was drawn, as this photo makes pretty clear, I think, toward the apse and toward the altar. So how did the church architects make the altar more visible? Well, note that there are steps leading to the altar. Okay, this is a very busy diagram with lots of that dangerous building that gets me messed up. It includes more detail than you probably really need, but I find it intriguing that these Romanesque and Gothic vaults are actually the same height, but that the pointed arch and the ribbing make the Gothic arch appear higher. The rib vaults also create a rhythmic pattern that helps tie the ceiling together and create a greater impression of unity than we really see in Romanesque ceilings, even though, and maybe because, there are usually many more vaults or bays in a Gothic ceiling. Note the way the arches define the individual vaults, which are the organizing principle of a Gothic church, like the Romanesque bays. Now I'm going to try to build this slide. There we go. The nave elevation from Chartres helps show how these architectural changes translated into interior changes. An elevation is essentially a vertical slice of a building. In this case, it's a slice through the nave. This elevation of Chartres is not one of your required images. It does show up on the matching quizzes, but you need to understand these terms which do appear on the test. Chartres is one of the earlier Gothic cathedrals. Later Gothic cathedrals would soar even higher and include even taller clerestory windows. Still, you can see the big innovation that pointed arches, rib vaults, and flying buttresses made possible, which were huge stained glass windows. And here finally is that scary floor plan of Chartres Cathedral that's included in your matching quiz and therefore will be on your unit test. I won't go back over all these terms, but you should note that the vaults not only organize and define the space, but also give it a sense of rhythm. The nave is long relative to the transept. These churches were designed to hold an entire congregation of the city, rather than to accommodate pilgrims during monastic services. The radiating chapels open out more to the apses. They're not as closed off and become really part of the worship space. Once again, the form is related to the religious function. These are more congregational churches. So I realize that on your Chartres video, you saw a dizzying number of doorways and jam statues. This is the doorway that is included among the religious images. It's also indeed more commonly referred to as the royal portal. Essentially, these figures serve to introduce and support the themes of the sacred space, both physically and theologically. So what other sacred spaces that we've studied has sculptural carving on its facade that's designed to reinforce that religion's messages? And yes, that is a test question. So the Western royal portal predates the Great Fire of 1194. So while it's considered early Gothic, in some ways it's really a transitional work between Gothic and Romanesque. The sculptural program of the three doors is closely integrated. In other words, there's a very deliberate theme to these three doors. The tympani, the lintels, and the archivolts. And by the way, those are the carved arches above the tympanum, and they're basically the same as voussoirs. Together they emphasize the major events in Christ's life, mission, and divine plan. So here we see Christ's entrance into the world through the incarnation, that is, his human birth. Here we see Christ's departure with the ascension, completing his earthly ministry. And here in the middle, the central portal, we see Christ's second coming to judge the world at the end of time. And this in turn links to the jam figures below, who also stand for power, in this case both spiritual and temporal power. Again, they are almost certainly Old Testament kings, but they also are stand-ins of a sort for the French king in nearby Paris, who was closely associated with his cathedral. You'll recall that Queen Blanche of Castile in particular donated the most famous of the stained glass windows, or at least the one that's going to appear on our test. But it's the Old Testament figures and not French kings who gave the name to the portals. By the way, these portals were used by royalty and the church hierarchy only. Commoners couldn't go through these doors. Khan Academy has 3 videos on Chartres that I did not, believe it or not, assign, but I still highly recommend them. particularly the first one, which talks about pilgrimages, the transition from Romanesque to Gothic, the history of Chartres Cathedral, the central role played by the Virgin Mary and by French kings, and the royal portal. That's a lot of important information, and the podcast is only 5 minutes, so I think it would be a good use of your time. I've put the URL on this slide, and I put all 3 of the Khan Academy Chartres podcasts up on Moodle. This slide compares the central tympanum of the royal portal at Chartres with the tympanum from the Romanesque pilgrimage church that is one of our required churches. Note that they are both pilgrimage churches in the sense that pilgrims came to see Mary's tunic at Chartres, remember the one that was miraculously saved, as well as the relics of Saint Foy, In both churches, too, the tympanum shows Christ judging the world. But note that at Chartres, Christ is surrounded much less menacingly by the 4 evangelists as represented by their animal attributes. The Saint Foy Last Judgment, sorry, I'm switching back and forth between English and French pronunciation, which is not particularly clear. At any rate, by contrast, it's filled with wonderfully carved images of hell and the devil. It's simply a whole lot scarier. This shift from an emphasis on hellfire and damnation to Christ as teacher, savior, and Lord of the world reflects a change in the world view and the theological emphasis as Europe entered the High Middle Ages and the Gothic period. Okay, I'm almost done. The College Board used to love to ask questions about the English Gothic style, or perpendicular Gothic as it's called. This has disappeared from the list of required works, but I can't bear to have my students think that every Gothic church was built in France and looked like Chartres Cathedral. So, I left in a few questions about perpendicular Gothic on the test. To quote Wikipedia, the interior of Gloucester Cathedral conveys an impression of a cage of stone and glass. There's less tracery or ornate stonework, so the effect is more rectilinear, that is, rectangular. See how the nave has a look of a large rectangle? The curves of High French Gothic give way to a much more severe straight line. Rectilinear, I think, would actually be a better term than perpendicular, but perpendicular Gothic is the term that art historians use, and it's the one that's going to show up on your unit test. Actually, most of you are probably familiar with Gloucester Cathedral, or at least its cloisters. You just call it Hogwarts. I've put this clip of Gloucester Cathedral images, which includes excerpts from the movies, up on Moodle. And here, without Harry and friends, is the delicately and ornately decorated cloister with its famous fan vaulting. Oh, there are so many more churches that I should be showing you, not just in England and France, but in Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Poland, Russia, but you'll be relieved to know that I'm going to resist. My final review podcast will cover questions on the test that are not related to church architecture.